Hello, hello, hello. Good morning. I have a couple of announcements. We got a lot going on in the month of September. Next Tuesday, September 16th, is the Aging My Way Resource Fair. There is a flyer out there. SAJE is one of the sponsors. And there's over 65 booths. I call it like trick or treat for grown-ups because they give you all kinds of handouts, candies, little trinkets and stuff like that, but there's also some good information. So stop by, say hello. And that's over at St. Margaret Mary Parish on Ringer Road. Our next lunch meetup is on Monday, September 22nd at 1 o'clock, and we are meeting at Mike Duffy's in Kirkwood. So as just a courtesy to the restaurant, give me a call so I can give them a heads up and make reservations. Then our movie, which is September 25th, is Nana's. It's a comedy. It's about a guy that opens up an Italian restaurant, and the chefs are Italian grandmas. So I've had people tell me that it's really cute. And then this is in October, but October 1st, we're having a card making class. So those of you that went last year, Sandy Hansen, who is one of our participants, is leading the class. She will show you how to make 3 autumn seasoned greeting cards. So if you want Thanksgiving or Halloween or just autumn in general, you'll have something to make and take. So, and those are the activities that are coming up. Our speaker today, I serendipitously found out, you know, sometimes you're on the internet and you keep going from one site to website to website. Well, I found Mac's website and I was just blown away. I know a lot of you are quilters, and I've never seen quilting like this before, and I thought this would be something great to share. Mac is a senior at WashU. His degree, he has a dual degree in fine arts and computer sciences. So like both sides of the brain. I find this very interesting and intriguing. So I'm not going to talk anymore. I'm going to let Mac talk, and let's give him a big round of applause.
All right. Okay, great. Is everyone able to hear okay? Okay, wonderful. Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. And thank you for the really warm welcome, Liz. Thank you. My name is Mac Barnes. I am a senior at WashU studying computer science and studio arts in their interdisciplinary program. And hopefully today you'll get to see a little bit of, I brought a few quilts and then hopefully a lot of photos of quilts that maybe you find interesting. I would love to know who all in here is a quilter. Anyone? Okay, 2. Okay, great. I love it. I love it. A lot of times I'm presenting 2 other quilters, so I always just love to know the audience so that I don't go too far down one specific rabbit hole. Okay, great. So, even though we only have 2 actual quilters with us, I'd be curious to know, just maybe by a raise of hands, who all here either has a quilt or knows a quilter or has, gets positive, warm, fuzzy feelings when they think of quilts. Great emotion. Right, okay, everyone, right, pretty much. Who doesn't love a really warm quilt? And so I really want to start with that really great feeling because, and then hopefully try and expand upon how our feelings, emotions, connections in history to quilts is a really powerful tool that we can use to share other stories of other people. Okay. So just as a brief historical context, this is a quilt by Faith Ringgold called Church Picnic. And basically, this is trying to illustrate that quilts are a very intimate record of an experience oftentimes. Sometimes they're very geometric, but there's always a person who makes them, and there's always a story behind that person. There's a story of how they found the fabrics, what time period it's from. And in this case, which is maybe an extreme example, an intimate record of an actual event that happened, or a series of events that happened, or memory. And so quilting can really be more than just a photograph, but a really beautiful story between both the maker, what they saw, and the fabrics they used to communicate that with us. Quilting has also been used as a messaging technology, if we want to. That might be a sort of strange way to put it, but I think we all maybe grew up with or have heard stories of quilts or quilt blocks being used in the Underground Railroad during the Civil War. And while I know there's a debate amongst the scholars of whether or not and to what degree those were used, I think the more important thing is that it's plausible. It makes sense. These really geometric, simple shapes can be used to signal different things to different people, and can be used as a technology in a way to create things that go beyond the quilt itself, like in the case of the Underground Railroad, the movement of slaves from the south to the north, right, in a safe way. So the takeaway here is that it is very plausible, and I think that we've seen throughout the history of quilting more and more messaging is a key component of what a quilt is, and what is it telling you, even though it might just be these simple shapes. There's always something underneath it, or a story behind it. So a little bit about me. How did I get started in textiles? So I am from Charlotte, North Carolina, so I'm a little bit a ways from home. But I grew up in being surrounded by textiles. So my grandmother was an avid, and she's still with us, but no longer crochets to the same degree, but was a crocheter. And she made hundreds and hundreds of red, white, and blue blankets for wounded veterans. She herself was a veteran, and so this idea of using fiber, using textiles as a way to give back to the community, again, transform beyond just the item itself, but do good or do more, I think is something that I've always been around. There are also quilters in their group, and then that's me with my first blanket that I made for them when I was about 8 or 9. I didn't get the red, white, and blue memo, so I don't know why I went with the camo green, but I guess a 9-year-old me was opinionated and wanted to do that. But they're still distributing blankets to today for, I think they're going on their 26th or 27th year. So quite a long time. So where did I go from there? So I've always sort of I started with crocheting, started with knitting, and then was like, ooh, what are those quilters doing over there in the group? And so, but from learning from them, and then also through YouTube and sort of self-teaching, experimenting, just natural copying what people do. One of my favorite quilters is actually from Missouri, Star Quilt Company from Missouri, so it's kind of funny that I grew up watching her and I ended up in Missouri. But I had an Etsy store for a little bit, but that didn't have the same sort of social good impact that I grew up around, and it's more business-minded. But I picked it up. I was always doing, sewing for myself. It's my sort of therapy. But I picked it up when I was a junior in high school. This was during COVID, and I was in an American Studies course, and had found the work of Bisa Butler, another incredible quilter. I definitely recommend those who are interested to look her up. But of telling American stories through making quilts that look like portraits, and that really kick-started the gears in my head of how can I use these skills. I was at the North Carolina School of Science and Math, so we were learning all these math, science, and engineering skills. I said, how could I bring that to quilting? That led me to make an entire portfolio, which I have some of those to share with you today. and that got me to the Scholastic Art and Writing Awards in New York City, which was a really wonderful experience. And that took me to a number of quilting organizations, both national and here, and as well as WashU. So, where I'm now studying computer science and textiles. But for those of you who don't know, they are quite intertwined. Some people like to say that they're left and right-brained, but the origins of computing are in textile looms. So I think that there's a very interesting relationship between the two that isn't so different. So the first portrait quilt that I made, I was told that I had to, we had learned all these stories through reading the anthologies of American history with all of these different characters, identities of people, stories over these long time periods, and so we had to show that we, with our final project, we could do anything we wanted or write an essay, but we had to show that we learned what we were supposed to. I do not like writing. I did not want to write an essay, so I spent probably 5 times as long making a quilt. But I had taken the collage of all of these identities and all of these people that I had read about and created this quilts using other scraps and things. And it was really my first attempt to make a face or make a portrait or make something that we could recognize as people. And that was in December of 2020. This is now hanging up at the school, so I did good on the project. But I always come back to this piece because at the time I was sort of critical of myself of it. Oh, it doesn't. Kind of looks like a very simple paint by numbers, or it doesn't look like a photograph. But seeing how people respond to it and like to pick out historical characters from it, even though they're not based on any set of particular people, has been really fascinating. And this idea of everyone being a part of the American cultural identity, whether we like it or not, is, I think, relevant to today and something I keep coming back to. So then, after I created that one, I said, okay, maybe instead of creating these more ambiguous figures, what if we could talk about real people? I think during this time, it was 2020, during COVID, and also during a lot of intense civil discourse, you often saw, and I think still do, a lack of empathy amongst those conversations. And so I think that conversation of empathy stemmed from a lot of us, a lot of times, and it's really easy to do, seeing people for what they say or what they believe in, not necessarily who they are or where they came from or why they are the way they are. And so that's where this idea of a walk in their shoes came from. And so it's like, if we can use this really warm, fuzzy feeling that we associate with quilts to de-escalate, to start the conversation, and maybe even share a little bit about who someone is, then perhaps we can have a better, more productive conversation about the difficult things, the difficult dialogues that we're having. And so these are all 6, and I'll get to the other 3 in a minute, are based on North Carolinians that they were the first 6 I talked to, but they all had really incredible stories of overcoming racism, of overcoming relationship and gender violence, all kinds of things, or even just simple topics like coming of age. It can be really beautiful stories, natural disasters. So all of these things that these people had overcome and had very poignant perspectives on, I wanted to capture and share with other people, but maybe do so through non-traditional means, because they say a picture's 1,000 words, but if you try and tell someone's life story in 1,000 words, you're going to run out of space pretty quickly. It's a pretty tough thing to do. So you can imagine it presented a challenge from creating a single image that encapsulated where they've been, who they are now, and where they're going. So if you'd like to, I have a wonderful quilt holder inlet. Yes, so we can start with that one. These were the other 3, and I'll get to them but again, all based on real people, real stories. And some of them use processes such as one quilt I lit on fire because in the interview she said her nickname growing up was Phoenix, which and then their story of understanding faith over time, I think really, despite the actions of other people, really I think the phoenix metaphor was a really strong and simple way to communicate that. Yep, so I'll get to that in just a second, but great question. Yeah, sure, feel free to. Using embroidery for handwriting, so the text you see on the outside of this particular quilt is the handwriting of the person that got put into software and then embroidered. So using these technology tools to bring you, the viewer who've never met this person, closer to them and understand their story better, as opposed to just using a font or letters. You could actually use their handwriting, which I think is really great. So I'll talk about this one in particular because it's one that people gravitate to, and it's one I have to actually show you the physical quilt. This was someone who had overcome domestic and sexual relationship violence and at a young age, and was still able to have a really great perspective on life after that event. And what struck me was her particular analogy to this Japanese pottery technique called kintsugi, where they intentionally break the pottery apart and put it back together with gold to make it more beautiful, to make it stronger, and to make it more valuable. And so I think that her perspective of, despite the things that happened to her, overcoming them has made her more valuable, stronger, and overall a more beautiful person, I think was a wonderful way to encapsulate the story. I think there's also a darker side to the story as well in terms of the lyrics that are her handwriting around the face. Particularly for those who can't read on the screen, it's a Sam Fender song called 17 Going Under that came out about the time in 2021 this quilt was made. And the lyrics are, "I was far too scared to hit him, but I would hit him in a heartbeat now." So it's very, very powerful and very moving lyrics that she related to. And then I want to show one other, and I'll go back to here from this series, and it is this yellow quilt on top. Thank you. So this is a very interesting story in that it came from someone I didn't personally know, but was recommended that I speak to, and was someone who grew up in Illinois. So, and had experienced the Plainfield tornado of 1990. And nothing short of a miracle, despite her mother ended up being killed in the tornado, unfortunately, but her and her brother, despite everything around them being essentially destroyed and them being picked up as well by the winds, was unscathed. They were okay. And so, experiencing that and then becoming a mother herself, her relationship with faith and asking, why did this happen to me? And then the relationship with her mother, both at a young age and sort of after the event, I think was it was one of my favorite conversations that I had while doing this project. And a particular quote that stood out to me from this interview was that she said, sometimes on paper, if you look at my life, the mountains, the peaks of the mountains are where or people would say, oh, you're on the top of your game, or the most good things have happened to you. But she said, I've learned the most and have enjoyed the most when I was sort of in the valleys of my life. And so I think that was something that stuck with me, and that I wanted to communicate both through the visuals of the quilt and the story behind it, all tied in with her relationship with religion, and also her mother and the actual natural disaster itself. All right. So, and then one other that I'll talk about that's maybe a little bit more involving of technology was this, which tells the story of a community. And so I don't have that one, so I'll let you know when the next one is. Thank you. So this one is a collage of faces like the first one, but instead of them coming from sort of historical figures, they came from an entire library of photos of people from a school community, my high school community, that were students, staff, alumni, and community members. And so that whole library of photos got put into a computer system, and the computer said, here are images of people who don't exist, but based on what you told me could exist, which is kind of an interesting idea. And so those are the images of people who are, a representative of the future, you could say, or of the people in the past and the present who have been a part of the school community. And those are the faces that got collaged to create the image that I worked from. And then using the scraps of quilters from the area that the school was in and other quilters from around North Carolina constructed the actual face. And then the quilting on the piece, so what holds everything together is a roadmap of the city. So I was able to program essentially a giant sewing machine to stitch out the roadmap of the city. So you can physically see where the school is and where it's situated amongst the surrounding community, this one in Durham, North Carolina. So again, using technology to tell the story of a community as opposed to an individual person, but still the same sort of principles and a lot of times the same technology. So after, you can imagine these are full of little tiny pieces and very tedious, and I had wanted to do something a little bit more freeing, or just not portraits, or wanted to do maybe venture into something more abstract after this. I was jealous of my painting friends who could kind of just put a big broad stroke on canvas, and I was over here with tweezers, like cutting out little tiny pieces of fabric. Outside of the world of portraits, there are a few pieces I want to talk about. This is a pattern that I had made myself based on a math symbol, actually, but that I think generalizes to a lot of our daily life. So it's the white symbol in the middle, and it's an equal sign with the little squiggle on top. And for those of you who don't know, in math, it just means, oh, it's close enough, like it's good enough. Or it's approximately equal. And so I think that's a really great, I think you could take that and apply it to any kind of part of our lives where we're saying, that's good enough. Or think about social progress of, we're close, but we're not all the way there. This sort of idea of almost being equal, I think is really interesting. This work is also a color wheel, so you have all of the colors of that you would see in a color wheel, plus the lights and the darks, and all of the neutrals. So that's also kind of interesting. It's also interesting given the technique that this requires. It requires absolute precision, not close enough precision. So that's kind of an interesting thing that I didn't think of at first, but another quilter pointed out. They said, oh, that's kind of funny how everything around it required absolute precision, but the message is, it's good enough. This is another work that is in a public space. So I don't know, has anyone seen or heard of t-shirt quilts before? Yeah, but a lot of times people will take their t-shirts and give them to a quilter who will cut them up into squares so you can see the image and remember it, because maybe it's a shirt you don't wear, it doesn't fit anymore, but you want to remember it. Then they'll sew them together and give you back this quilt that is a memory quilt, essentially. I'd done a few of those and kind of had thought that the squares were interesting, but I wanted more of a challenge, and also maybe weren't fully representing the person who had lived through all those experiences. We wear a t-shirt and it goes throughout our lives. It sees everything we do, and it was there for everything. And so when I had the opportunity, this was for a YMCA in Charlotte, and they had all of these shirts that staff had from COVID. My grandmother also works at this YMCA, and she had some as well. So they had all these shirts and masks and gaiters and all these other things that were fabric textiles that had lived through COVID and had seen the sort of relationship with the community evolve over that time. They wanted a t-shirt quilt made out of it. But I really just didn't think putting them into squares did it justice. And so, or told the sort of moving story of how they all came together, or all of the good that happened, all of the difficulties. And so I was inspired by a stained glass artist on Instagram who creates these really beautiful geometric, bright, colorful shapes. And if you can see it in the image, the actual YMCA logo, it's turned sideways, but it's in there, and then it's sort of segmented and cut up a bunch of times, and all of those t-shirts were used to create the image. And then this quilt was actually quilted, even though their shirts were North Carolina, was quilted here in St. Louis at a local sewing center. So I think that's a kind of interesting connection. And now it's in North Carolina, in their lobby, and kind of is a hallmark or a reminder of not just the community that they had during COVID, but the hopefully continued story of community. This is another example of a t-shirt quilt in this fashion, but this one, the shape is a butterfly as opposed to like the logo, and was all of this particular person's jerseys from playing soccer over the years. And so, but loves butterflies. So what an interesting combination, but is just another example of memorializing the events and the experiences and life that these shirts lived. I mean, they were very well loved. And then this is another example of a collaboration. I'm going to bring this one because this was in collaboration with a St. Louis artist. So Matt Bryan is a math and computer science genius in my mind, and he has degrees from SLU, and he takes photos of St. Louis or pulls photos from interesting places and tells the computer, move this pixel here, change the color of this one. He gives it a set of rules, and then what comes out are these really geometric, really interesting photos that maybe pick up on parts of the photo you wouldn't have thought of, you wouldn't have looked at first, or you would have noticed. Maybe it makes a stain on a brick like really big, or maybe it just does different things. And so I thought that was a really interesting process, picking out normal everyday artifacts and making them beautiful. And a lot of his work, even though he's not a quilter, looks like quilts. And so I wanted to try and recreate one of his digital images in the sort of tangible fabric world, bring it to life, but using traditional quilting techniques. And using fabrics from around St. Louis as well. And so that's exactly what this is. So number 3 on this image is what I use as my starting point, and number 4 is the quilt that we have here. This is some of the process. So the process is more traditional, but the design that Matt did is very much technology heavy, focused on using kind of cutting edge software. So again, another interesting meld of tradition and technology to tell an interesting story with fabric. Some more improvisational work. Like I said, these were also pretty tedious projects. So I wanted to just do something where I sewed fabric together, and then if I didn't like it, I cut it up and rearranged and sewed it back together. Then kept doing that until I was happy, and kind of broke all the rules of quilting, where everything has to be kind of perfect and nice and sewn. And this is one work that has all the scraps, the black and white scraps that I had, and there's lace in there. There's, I think, leather as well. There's vinyl. There's Halloween fabric. So if you look, there's actually a witch, and like a little tiny witch in there that made it. There's all these kinds of little. It's kind of a hide and seek of texture and images, and just another fun process. Like the process did not involve any technology, just my sewing machine and scissors, right? So no technology used in this, but still an interesting story of just the actual making of the work and breaking the rules of quilting. Here are some other examples of using those same techniques. What I'll point out about the orange particular work on the left is that when you cut out using a machine all of the intricate pieces for the portraits, there's a negative. There's the rest of the fabric that you don't use. And I had tons and tons of those, but they had really interesting shapes, and they were, again, my own scraps, but were originally scraps of other quilters, and so that's what these are. These are all of the sort of remaining leftovers from the portraits that made it into this work, which I think is kind of cool. So, and they aren't from a particular person, they're from all kinds of different portraits and from all across the different projects, but kind of highlight the negative of the fabric. Then I still had more and more scraps. Yeah, feel free to, I'll actually demonstrate with this one. So I wanted to make a pillow because it's much smaller than the other ones, and it was kind of fun. And it was actually part of a class project where we were tasked to make an object that lets you do something you can't do right now. She called it a prosthetic, but I think that's a very wide term. You can kind of run with that in any direction. But I'd be curious if anyone here has ever wanted to send a text message to someone or an email or a letter, but maybe refrains from doing so because they either know better or they're not around, or but would like the satisfaction of being able to actually send that message. I know I definitely have, but that's exactly what this allows you to do. So using the same technology that you would see in a grocery store to tap to pay, this actually allows you to tap your phone on the pillow and send a text message into the void, and it goes to an empty inbox. So you get the satisfaction of hitting send, but you don't actually, it doesn't go to the person who you would intend it for, and it is kind of a relief from what you wanted to share, an unburdening to speak. So I'll pass this around. It's also in the shape of a text bubble. So this is more of a playful quilt object, but again, a use of these, it's called NFC chips, but this technology that is newer, but allows us to do more things, allows us to actually go up and touch the quilt and put our phones up against it or feel it, as opposed to just looking at it on a wall or on a bed. And I think that's a really important part of quilt work is, in our everyday lives, we cuddle with the quilts, we touch them, we form bonds with them, but when we see them in art studios or galleries, we have to stand back, we can't touch, I want to increase interaction with them as much as possible. And so that this work was an experiment in that. Let's see. The next two are just some other examples. These were actually shown in the St. Louis Artists Guild last spring with other quilters from Missouri, Oklahoma, and Kansas, and it's traveling throughout those 3 states for the next year or so. But we were given words that were in a different language that had no direct English translation, but were about the environment. So a lot of times there's a whole website called Living Language Land that documents these words. But a lot of times there's a long, sort of lengthy paragraph describing the translation because it doesn't have a direct English word. And so they wanted us to create quilts that were a translation so that people wouldn't have to read the paragraph, they could see it and sort of get it or understand further what someone else thinks the word means to them. And so each word got 2 quilters who made completely different works but were about the same word. And so the next 2 are 2 that I had. So this one was essentially roughly translation to animal tracks. And so the original image was animal tracks that then again got cut up and moved around and embroidered onto this final work. The next piece, which it's shown pretty well actually here, was about on an island in the middle with the trees and this sort of sacred magical place, or the feeling you kind of associate with the area around that little place on that island. And so it was from, I believe, Southeast Asia was where the origination of the word comes from. But like that's like a hard thing to explain to someone without writing out a sort of full, broader definition. And so this one was a bit trickier for me, but again, was using technology to take an image of that location that they used as reference and enhance it with stitching, in this case also with laser engraving, like again, new technology, and fabric in order to tell the story better or to tell the definition better. Another reason I wanted to use, so I don't know if anyone's ever seen someone use a laser before, but you have to wear goggles, and they're pretty cool. So that's why I wanted to use it, because you get to use the fancy goggles. Lastly, I want to share another collaboration with Matt Bryan. So I don't. Do people know about the Del Mar Divine facility, or are familiar with the hospital off of Del Mar and Bell Avenue? It's gone through a number of names. Okay. Yep. And so it is now. It was abandoned.
My sister graduated from there in 1956.
Oh, from the nursing school? Wow.
Clinical instructor.
Wow.
And then she went to Barnes School of Nursing and
Mm-hmm.
was the director of the school.
Wow. So you never know who's in the audience. That's awesome. But yeah, so St. Luke's that was eventually abandoned and was no longer a hospital for that community as well. And so Maxine Clark, who founded Build-A-Bear, who's still in St. Louis, decided to revitalize the hospital and turn it into a wonderful place for nonprofit office spaces, mixed income housing. There's a delicious deli there, a pharmacy. And so that story of transformation over time was really beautiful. And also thinking about surrounding the hospital, or that sort of icon of this big building. There's been so many different communities that have moved in, moved out, different restaurants that have been there and left, some have stayed. And so it really has this fascinating history, especially in the context of Del Mar being historically redlined, so there's that component of it as well. And so I thought this was a story that other people, especially outside of St. Louis, would love to hear, this story of this rebirth of this building, essentially. And so I wondered if Matt could use his great skills in computer science to take images of that whole historical timeline, both black and white and color, and use them to tell the story of change and colorize this aerial view of the hospital from, I believe, the 1950s. And so that's exactly what he did. So we consulted with community members. We got a grant from WashU as well. And we came up with this as the final. Oh, these were photos of the collage of all the different, or one of the collages of all the different photos of color from over time that were in the community, the West End community. So you have paintings of buildings, you have menus, you have restaurants, you have housing locations, you have photos from festivals, all throughout this, paintings that were on the sort of like graffiti type paintings, all kinds of stuff that were indicative of the community over time. And Matt used this as a sort of palette, a painting palette, to recolor and the original black and white image and to tell the story of change. And this is the image he came up with, which I think is really interesting. The idea is that, like these portrait quilts, they spark a dialogue. The work itself is not the conversation, but it gets you interested. You say, oh, why, what is that? What is that telling the story of? And I want to know more. And that's exactly what I hope that this work does. And so this was just a digital image, and so then Matt's work was done, and then my work began to turn this into a quilt. So again, back to the little tiny pieces and scissors, and sourcing all of those different wonderful colors of fabrics from around St. Louis. And that's exactly what I did. And this is the final quilt that is hanging now at Del Mar Divine in one of their classrooms. Again, with the idea that dialogue will happen, not just about this community and the cycles of change that have happened over the last 120 years, but about other ways that change can be seen, whether positive or good, in our lives, in our communities, in our world. And so I really, really love this piece as not just the hardest quilt that I've ever had to make, but a really great starting point for dialogue that also tells a beautiful story, or at least gets you interested in the beautiful, complex, diverse history of the West End region. And this summer, the National Dialogue Conference was here at WashU, and they were able to hold dialogue space in this actual room. So I think that's a very cool success story, and hopefully many more dialogues will happen with this piece as a sort of starting point. Here's some up-close images of the quilt being made. So you can see there's all these little tiny pieces of, and that were, again, I used technology to cut them out, but used traditional quilting techniques to put them together. And then the last quilt I want to share with you, is anyone here familiar with Margaret Atwood's writing, Handmaid's Tale, perhaps? Yes. Oh, got one in the back. Okay. So this quote, I was really inspired by not just the book, but also the series on Hulu that tells the story of Handmaid's Tale. But I particularly was drawn to this quote in Margaret Atwood's writing and the story behind it. And it wasn't until after I had watched the series that I looked up the meaning and the story behind this. And you would think it would be Latin, and I think in the movie it's portrayed as Latin, but Atwood said that it really came from her grade school class when she was learning Latin, and it doesn't actually completely translate directly. It's something that they kind of came up with on their own. It's kind of nonsense, you could say, given that it's not English and it's also not Latin. It's something they kind of came up with on their own. I didn't know what it meant when it was first introduced in the story plot. And you could take guesses, but you probably also wouldn't know exactly what it meant as well. And again, going back to this idea of quilt as messaging technology, you might at first not understand what something is, what it means, or the story behind it, but perhaps the quilt gets you interested, or perhaps the quilt could tell you the story or the meaning behind it. And so that's exactly what I attempted to do with this last quilt. If you want to show, yeah, if you could hold. No, just you can hold it up. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So this particular quilt on the front has the quote, right? And you aren't exactly sure what it means. At least I wasn't at first. But the idea is that perhaps, like Atwood's writing, and the context and the story behind it, the quilt too could tell you the definition, and so maybe shed a little light on what the quilt means. Which, for those of you who aren't able to see that clearly, it means don't let the bastards grind you down, which I think is quite an interesting message today. Whatever that means to you, I definitely. Without sharing too much, have my own interpretation of what that means to me. But I think it's really effectively used in her, in Atwood's writing, and also I think something that we often need to be reminded of. But quilts, sort of like Atwood's writing, can shed light and give context to what otherwise may just be nonsense that we hear or come up with in this world. And so when I think about the future of quilting, or what I hope people are able to take away, is that this idea of telling stories through quilts, even though I'm using technology, it is ingrained in the culture of quilts. It is what they've always been and what I hope they continue to be, just maybe using new tools to do so. So it's a concept rooted in quilting's history, but needed today to tell the stories that we will learn from tomorrow. And so with that, I will open it up for questions, and perhaps we can, if people want to dim the lights to see the quilt better, we can do that too.
How long does it take you? Like one from the hospital.
Sure.
So someone didn't
Oh. So I'll say I quite frankly didn't want to know how long that one would take me because I'd probably feel some type of way about it. But for reference, the portraits take about 50 to 100 hours from the time of including the interview, the iterations, working digitally to come up with the image, to actually cutting out all the pieces, sewing it all together. And so the Del Mar Divine quilt, and it's actually partially unfinished, and so my goal this semester is to completely finish it because I just could not get it done in the year I was working on it. And it probably took about, probably upwards of 500 hours, if I had to guess, or will by the time it's done. But any other questions or things people wanted to see again? Yes?
Are any of your works hanging in a museum? They're very beautiful.
Well, thank you. Not in a museum, but I've been able to do a few shows at the I've done one show at the North Carolina Contemporary Art Museum and at several galleries, including the St. Louis Artists Guild, Art St. Louis, which unfortunately is no longer around, and a number of galleries back in North Carolina. All of the permanent installations have been at what you could call like places of community, like the YMCA or the schools, or other places in sort of private buildings. Yes.
Did you make that shirt that you're wearing?
I wish I did. I did not. I found this when I was visiting Madison, Wisconsin for the first time this summer, and I thought it was too cool to not have, and I thought it fit this theme pretty well. So, yes.
You mentioned that you used a laser to cut fabric.
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't that scorch it? I mean, I'm thinking of laser cutting with metals and things like that, plastics.
Yes. So, for those who didn't hear, the question was about the laser. Doesn't it burn the fabric, or doesn't it maybe ruin the fabric? And in this case, and I can go back. In this case, there were 2 layers of fabric, and I was trying to get rid of the top layer in some places and keep it in some other places to create an image. So if you can see, in some places there's lighter green, in some places there's darker green. And that's because the laser was on when you see lighter green and removed the top darker green, and it was off when you see the darker green. And so it intentionally burned away that top layer. So you can use it to your advantage. When you want to cut fabric, you have to have the settings just right, because otherwise, yes, you will definitely burn, depending on what the fiber is, you can burn it.
And what type of fiber is that?
Yep, so the top layer, I believe, is a nylon, and the bottom layer was a cotton. And then there's just a fusible layer in between to keep them together.
And then when you cut your pieces, do you use a scissors or do you use a Cricut or some kind of?
Great question. Yeah, so when I cut out all my pieces, especially for the precise ones, I use a Cricut because I can take what I draw on an iPad and send it to the computer, and it'll cut it out of whatever size I need, which is convenient. But for some other like improvisational work, it's entirely just traditional rotary cutter scissors. Yeah.
Does anybody know what a Cricut is? No. Would you explain what
Oh,
a
sure.
Cricut is?
Yeah. So sometimes the questions, especially from quilters, can, like I said, can get too in the weeds. So I want to make sure it's accessible for everyone. But the Cricut is essentially like a printer, but instead of a print head, it has a knife. And so it can go and cut out specific shapes that you tell it to. So you don't need, I'm sure if people have seen like die cut machines before, like in schools that would press out letters, you have to put in a die and you have to cut it all out. And that like wooden block, like a stamp, is like a stamp. Like you can only make that shape with that stamp. But this is electronic and lets you cut any shape with just one knife tool. So you think of all the little tiny facial features and things, that's really helpful. Yes?
Have you seen the graffiti wall on the riverfront here in St. Louis?
Yes, I think it's really awesome.
I thought you could get a lot of good inspiration.
Yes, I mean, St. Louis in general, I think the architecture is so fascinating. Being from Charlotte, which is a much newer city, a lot of the architecture looks very different here, and I think for the better. But and also such a vibrant art scene with not just thinking about architecture, but thinking about graffiti, thinking about all the 23 quilt guilds that are in the St. Louis area. Charlotte has one, right? So like, there's so much to take inspiration from. I was just hearing about the sculpture garden. I didn't even know that existed. So you learn something new every day. Any other questions? All right. Well, then thank you so much for your time today. I really enjoyed you all being here.
Thank you, Mac. That's fabulous.
Thank you.
We've got a great lunch downstairs, so we've got the elevator to go downstairs, or if you need your steps, they're at the end of the hall. Thanks for coming.
Would you like to join us for lunch?
I would love to.
Okay, great.